Hi, I'm Robin,
And I'm Vicky,
and you've joined us on Let's Get Curious.
on Matters That Matter. Today, Robin and I are talking about one of the most serious yet overlooked challenges of our time: loneliness. Dr Michelle Lim is the CEO of Ending Loneliness Together and a leading expert on connection, belonging, and community wellbeing. She's dedicated her career to understanding why loneliness is rising across all ages, from young people feeling isolated in a hyper-connected world to older adults struggling with loss and disconnection, and the real impacts this is having on their mental well-being. Her research and the work is guiding policy and system changes across the globe. In this episode, we explore what research is uncovering, why connection matters more than ever, and how each of us have a role to play in ending this growing loneliness pandemic. So let's get curious on the topic of loneliness.
Hello, Michelle. Welcome to our podcast. And Vicky and I would really like to thank you so much. You're a very busy lady, and thank you so much for making the time to speak with us today. We wanted to start by asking you just to share a little bit about yourself and what inspired your work in loneliness.
Thank you, Robin, for having me. And Vicky, it's lovely to be here today to have this wonderful conversation that hopefully will spark curiosity in your listeners and that they might learn something new today. A little bit of a background in terms of how I gotten into this space. At the moment, of course, I am the CEO of Ending Loneliness Together, which is a not-for-profit charity that's focused on addressing loneliness in Australians. I often joke and I call myself the reluctant CEO because I think I fell into. It was not an inspiration for me to actually. I didn't train to think that this is the role I was going to take. In fact, I'm a clinical psychologist by background, so I've been in practice for over 21 years now. And I often tell the story of someone coming from that lens in the service industry where about 25 years ago, 22 years ago, I was working I was training as a psychologist. At that stage when I was a young psychologist, I was often seeing and trying to assist people with what we call chronic psychotic disorders. So this is a very, very small portion of people. So less, 1% of the population would have a chronic or psychotic disorder. And this is a population in which, even with lots of medication and lots of psychosocial support, still experience what we call residual psychotic symptoms. And as you imagine, it's quite a distressing experience. If you just think about if you had these, kind of threatening beliefs, systems, or maybe you're hearing things that are quite threatening, most of the time you'll be living in fear and distress. And this is that very small population of people that we do see in the community. And as a training psychologist, what I noticed was that we did see, because they're so high needs, often we did see this group maybe sometimes 2-3 times a day, even on the weekend. So we had a service that was able to cater to a lot because this is a very vulnerable group of people. What really struck me, I think, was that despite the intensity of which we did see them, despite the frequency in which we did see them, and many of the cohort that we did see was also living with others. So they were actually not able to be independent. And if they were not living with their families, they were living in group homes. Okay, so we're talking about a high level impairment here. What struck me was despite being with a lot of people all the time, there was a high level of distress. And we know now in that national survey of psychosis that people with psychotic disorders identified loneliness as a challenge, or one of the top 3 challenge, in addition to employment and vocational training. And this kind of sparked my curiosity. Why is it that despite seeing this group multiple times a day, they still complain of that? And of course, we would offer even therapy on top of medication and assistance and a psychosocial assistance. There's a gap between what we can deliver in service, and we were not really able to meet the social needs of this very vulnerable group. That really worried me. And part of my PhD was looking at different facets of social relationships. And what we found in my research was that even if someone had kind of unusual beliefs, or perhaps they had, a psychotic disorder, if they did report relationships in their network, that was great. It did help. But the facet that we measured that really did moderate the stress was what we call reciprocity, which is a back and forth, in which, of course, you think about service delivery models, we don't have the ability to do the back and forth because we're helping someone, we're not necessarily asking them for help. And so reciprocity was very, very important. It was actually a thing that moderated the stress in people with psychotic disorders. But yet, that's actually something I couldn't do as a clinician on the ground. I couldn't ask the people that I was helping to help me.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So there's something that I couldn't do within the capacity of a service delivery provider. So long story short, I went on to do some work in social anxiety and went to the States to work on that area, but came into this area of loneliness where I kind of was able to put the pieces of the puzzle together, that loneliness is also something that exists in the community, so people without mental ill health. And what I did find was that if you were lonely, even if you didn't have a clinical mental health diagnosis, you were more likely to experience higher levels of depression, higher levels of social anxiety, higher levels of paranoia in general population. And this is kind of being fearful of people, a fear of persecution in a non-clinical way, but there was still a high level of paranoia, and that we needed to do something about this idea of loneliness. We needed to think of it as an antecedent, as something, a precursor to future problems. But what we're very good at doing is, as clinicians or in mental health, is to tackle the kind of pointy end, tackle the suicidality, to tackle the mental ill health distress. And of course, we have our obligation to do that. But we're not very good at prevention. We're not very good at addressing loneliness, promoting social connection before the onset of problems down the line.
I think that that's certainly a great explanation of loneliness, thinking about social connection and how we can work more in an upstream and in a preventative approach. The one thing that I've noticed in the sector is that loneliness often gets confused to social isolation and social exclusion and then the social connection. So can you maybe just explain a little bit more about how they all work interchangeably or separately, just to give us some idea?
Yeah, and a really great question, actually, Vicky. If I use that example of what I just said about, us seeing this group of people all the time, and by definition, if we did see people all the time and they had lots of social interaction, they're not socially isolated. So this is what we call an objective state. Is that I can count the number of people that you know, I can count the number of social interactions you have. If you're living alone, you'll be considered more socially isolated than the people who are living within families, um, versus the subjective experience of the stress that comes up for you. And then what I would almost kind of say is aversive feelings. It's something you don't want to feel, because there are people who often say, oh, I'm by myself and I don't get upset by that. And then by definition, they're not lonely. They may be socially isolated, but they're not lonely. So they can happen independently. I'll often meet people who say, oh, I'm so used to my own company. I'm so used to not speaking to people. I'm an introvert. I don't need that many people for me and I'm not distressed by it. That's social isolation. And then the people who are like young people who are often embedded within our educational institution or community, who often report of loneliness. I don't have anyone to talk to. I don't have anyone to turn to, even when I'm around people. Yes, I might have parents here, but I feel like I can't confide in them. They're not by definition socially isolated, but they still feel lonely. And they are interrelated. People think that one is worse than the other. Actually, they're equivalently bad for you. Even the people who are living by themselves, right now they think it's fine, but actually, in the years of research and medical research that we've looked at, social isolation at its worst is a form of torture and causes distress to people as well, and that being socially isolated is as bad for you in terms of your mortality and your morbidity. But what happened probably in the last, 20 years, people have realized it's not just being physically alone that's harmful, it's also if you feel alone that's harmful. So that's the real difference here, is that that literature has caught up to say, oh, it's not just actually being physically alone. If you just feel alone, that is equally bad for your health and mortality. That said, I think I want to kind of preface this by actually saying, loneliness itself is an innate signal for us to connect. But because of the stigma, because of misconceptions of what it is and what it's not, and whether one's allowed to be lonely or not, people don't seek help or they don't try to address loneliness early. And what happens is that the more we neglect these basic innate human needs, the worse it becomes. It's very similar to if I ignore a hungry signal. So if I'm hungry and I ignore it, you know, that's going to be a problem. And so loneliness is very much baked into our DNA. If you're lonely, it's just a signal for you to do something different about your social relationships, that you need something different to what you have right now, and that's okay. And that we can do something or look into it and think about what is it that you need and reflect on that. Whereas right now, people feel lonely and they think, oh, I must be depressed. Or they feel lonely and they think, oh, I don't want to deal with this. So, what we're really doing is trying to change that understanding and the language around how we actually address loneliness.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And it's often that stigma too, isn't it, for people to actually say, I am feeling lonely is quite significant for people to actually verbalize it as part of that process. So, and have the insight to be able to do that.
In our State of the Nation report in 2023, we actually looked at that, like we surveyed about over 4,000 Australians across the nation. About 1 in 2 Australians say they feel ashamed when they feel lonely. And another 1 in 2 Australians say they will actively conceal their loneliness. So
Yeah.
you can imagine how difficult it is for us to know if someone is lonely or not. And the statistics are almost 1 in 3 Australians will feel lonely at any given time. 1 in 6 would feel what we call significantly problematic levels at any given time, and about 26% of Australians feel persistently lonely. So if they become lonely, they're staying lonely. And to me, it's not so much about whether someone is lonely or not. If it is baked into our DNA, then actually that high prevalence is fine. But it's that 1 in 6 Australians and that feel, problematic levels, the high levels at any given time, or the 1 in 4 that once they become lonely, they're staying lonely. Those are the cohorts that I worry about more.
So, Michelle, just to summarize, is depression part of loneliness, or what would you describe as the key factors in loneliness?
Yeah.
Simply feeling alone?
So depression is a much more broader construct where you feel negative about every aspect in your life, whereas loneliness is very, very focused on just the interpersonal components. They are psychometrically a little bit different, but often loneliness is measured in depression as well. We know that loneliness predicts depression, but the relationship doesn't happen the other way around. So depression does not necessarily predict loneliness. And this in lies the problem with the way mental health clinicians think about it and the way most people think about it. They think that loneliness is a byproduct of mental ill health, when in fact we're seeing it actually it's the antecedent. It's not necessarily the consequence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I was going to say, we've had a huge few years with COVID, and I think particularly in Victoria, where we are from. Could you just maybe just enlighten us the impact that that would have had on the increase in incidence in loneliness,
Mm.
and how is that still playing out?
That's a really good question because there's an immense amount of studies around loneliness and COVID. And I often think of loneliness as what we call something that has I'm going to try not to go into the psychometrics of it, but basically, most people have almost a baseline of loneliness. And when certain things happen in our lives, we fluctuate. So it goes up. But there's always then the baseline that we revert back to. That's the way I would describe it. In psychometric terms, you call it state trait, type for the psychologists in there, they will understand that. And what we found was that there's an external trigger and stimulus during COVID. So everyone's loneliness went up. But right now we know that there's a baseline that most people has gone down. But what has shifted very clearly is actually the norms of interaction. So what young people are telling us in our report this year in 2025, which actually didn't occur to me at all, but when we kind of did a series of qualitative interviews with young people aged 16 to 25, and this is a cohort that went through high school during COVID.
Yes.
In my mind, as someone in their 40s, I was thinking to myself, COVID's over. No, let's get back to it.
Get on with it. Yeah.
Get on with it. But to young people, it's a traumatic experience. They're still raising it. They're like, I went through high school during COVID. Every expectation that they had of what university would look like or what their growing up years look like, even dating, all of those expectations had to change. And what a lot of young people were telling us as well in qualitative data is they were saying things like prior to COVID, the expectation of interaction was in person. We had clubs, we had school face to face, but post COVID, everything's changed. Is that there's acceptance of digital tools, acceptance of interacting. And while that was great, it took so long to get back into the face to face. It took so long. That's no longer the priority. That's actually the additive one now.
It's almost that change of that they had a rite of passage that they were all used to in some ways, and then that got halted or amended, and then all of a sudden they still can't find that norm in some ways. Was that a good summary of that?
There was almost anger about why is it that we are still doing online teaching? I can't make friends that way. I can't make friends online when we're learning together. Yes, we're learning together, but that incidental interaction of getting into the classroom together, leaving the classroom there, having that chat, getting to know that person in a much more informal, organic way, that was completely removed. And so for them, it's like the default's now online. What's university life look like now? And I certainly didn't go to university that way. Like we were expected to turn up in class.
Absolutely.
Yes.
To be on campus. We're expected to participate in clubs. We met a lot of friends. We had these massive networks, and I often joke we were expected to protest at universities, right? But these younger generations are reporting a very different experience. And of course, with the potential introduction of the social media restrictions, which I can understand why they were suggested and recommended in the first place, young people are saying, well, that's great, but there's no community infrastructure physically for me to actually go to. So if you want to restrict it for those younger generations, where are the
What are you supplementing it with, really?
exactly? And if you know behavior change, we should never take away something without replacing it, right? So young people are complaining about that because they are saying things, especially if they're from a vulnerable, marginalized community. Say if you're an LGBTQI youth, right? If you're living in a community, in your real life community that doesn't align with your values and your identity or accept your identity, that cohort of young people were using online platforms to find their people. If they're under 16, they're not going to be able to find their people anymore. What does that mean for that group? And a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty. I can understand why young people are feeling quite negative about about social life in these generations.
Lost.
Absolutely lost, angry, upset. We also have to battle the acceleration of other things like AI companionships
Yeah.
into our life. And, if you have children, and I do, that might be part and parcel of their social life. So we don't have any idea of how we can manage this shift to the demographic shift, where people are having fewer children, as well as the digital shift. We don't have any plans, any foundations of what that looks like in the future.
Michelle, you spoke a lot about young people and the impact of loneliness on young people. What I'd love to understand a little bit further is a little bit around what the evidence is showing some of the other population groups that are significantly impacted.
As you know, loneliness affects everyone and not just young people. And I think I mentioned young people before, but also affects different other age cohorts. So we do see spikes in the 45 to 56 range, that's because sandwich generation potentially, where you're caring for older parents, but you're also still parenting young ones. They're not fully adult yet. And then we do in some data see instances of loneliness that might spike in the over 75-year-olds in some data, especially when it's really counts with moments of bereavement, reduced social support, poor health. We also know that people with chronic disease, like those in over 75 who very much have a high incidence of chronic disease, having a chronic disease and having to manage a chronic disease really affects the way we relate to people. Takes away our time because medical management is often quite intensive for some of these conditions. We're talking about chronic kidney disease, or we're talking about diabetes or cardiovascular health. All those things fall under chronic disease, and about 1 in 10 Australians have a chronic disease. So having chronic disease increases our vulnerability. Being financially strained increases our vulnerability. That's a very clear effect that we see in big data. And of course, if you do have, if you're experiencing loneliness and persistent loneliness, it also increases psychological distress by 7 times. And when you have quite a high level of psychological distress, it could lead to mental ill health. I think the odds ratio if you're lonely increases I think your likelihood of having clinical depression and clinical social anxiety by around 2.5 fold. So those are what we call vulnerable cohorts. It can happen, of course, at any given time, but there are some vulnerable groups, whether it's your age, where you are experiencing social transitions, or you have some sort of pre-existing condition that actually predisposes you to feeling more lonely.
So I might take the liberty to then ask a little bit around systemically, thinking about the complexity of all of that. What do we and our governments and our welfare organisations, our NGOs, what can we be doing to support some of that complexity?
Yeah. What I see right now, and Ending Loneliness Together supports about 75 more organizations around the nation doing their bit, and that's great. What we're really trying to do really is to really encourage effective action where we're having this consensus approach, consensus understanding, and evidence-led approach, and harnessing and mobilizing people on the ground to come together to work on one mission, because we are much stronger together than if we were working individually. Because I see a lot of fantastic organizations doing great work, but they're not capitalizing on certain things, and they're not rolling out because they don't have the capacity to. There's still really a misunderstanding on the ground that this is a mental health issue. But actually, we know that this is a much wider issue. And this is where probably the problem that lies with loneliness itself. Because what government do is they tend to fund by portfolio. And so if, is this a mental health issue? Is this a physical health issue? Is this a social issue? We don't know. Like, maybe you wanted to fund this, or maybe you want to fund it. So it becomes this issue that just gets bounced around, right? Now, what the World Health Organization is doing, as you know from their commission to social connection, which is now probably a year and a half into their 3-year commission, is they're basically pushing all governments around the world to do a national strategy. Basically, they're saying you cannot ignore the scientific evidence of what loneliness and social isolation leads to. You need to think of an approach that's sound. It doesn't matter where you start, whether you start in social policy or mental health policy, it doesn't matter. You just got to start addressing it. And there were probably about 17 countries around the world already that have a national strategy. Some of them in social policy, some of them in mental health policy. Again, it doesn't really matter. Some of them have their own loneliness policy, which is great. It doesn't matter. We just need to start somewhere. And the reason for a strategy is to coordinate action, is to make sure that our actions also underpinned by evidence, to make sure that the government can also commit to executing a plan to address loneliness in an intersectoral way, together in a coordinated way to really make a difference, whether it's in our workplaces, our schools, our health systems, our community services. There needs to be some sort of coordination. So you can imagine it's a bit of a mammoth task, to coordinate, because right now we're not even speaking the same language. When I look at even government documents, the confusion between loneliness and social isolation and being used interchangeably. Really confusing.
Mm.
Look at this. I'm like, how do they measure it? There's absolutely no transparency around how it's measured, how it's being dressed. It's one when it's murky on that level, it just means that any solution that you try to introduce will not be effective.
It's almost that silo approach in some ways, and bringing it into that collective action, collective approach where there's outcomes and there's measures that we are all collectively working towards will allow governments of bodies, our organisations, our schools, as you said, to create that at least common direction. And I love the fact that you've talked about evidence-based practice or initiatives. Can I ask you what some of those may be that would really have a positive impact?
It does, but it also depends on your cohort. Remember, loneliness is so subjective, right? So what might work for me might not work for someone else. And there are lots of different kinds of interventions that also focus on really specific targeted populations, like someone with chronic disease, or maybe someone with mental ill health, or children coming from foster homes. They're very specific. What my colleagues and I did was this massive meta-analysis, and this is still not widely released, but it's been accepted in publication, where we review over 200 interventions from around the world. What they found is that most interventions do work, right? Most of them do, but that is if they specifically target loneliness. Loneliness is a primary outcome because not all interventions have loneliness as a primary outcome. Some are showing bigger effects than others purely because they're being measured and analyzed more. So CBT, for example, cognitive behavior therapy, analyzed a lot more because that's kind of much more likely to be funded, much more likely to be supported by research. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're definitely much, much better. It just means that were able to harness more data. The issue with some of these approaches, though, is that with CBT, for example, especially in Australia anyway, in this landscape, you know, CBT tends to be administered by psychologists or very senior clinicians or psychiatrists. It takes years of training, and I'm trained in CBT, but it took me what, minimum of 6 years, and it's just not tenable. If you're looking at low middle income countries, looking at communities without resources, do we have access to psychologists? Absolutely not. So we need to think about the context in which these interventions are being delivered and what is the next best thing. One of the other studies that I did, which I think was really interesting, that was highlighted at the WHO Commission's report, is the impact of kindness. And kindness is not something we have to teach. Well, maybe for some people, but for us, raise our children to be kind. Most of us, 90% of the population, uh, the kindness is something that we fostered. And it's also not necessarily a skill that we have to learn from a psychologist, And we ran this massive study during COVID. It's made out of three international randomized controlled trial, and we found that kindness, and even just one act of kindness per month, it is just a very small amount, has benefits for the giver, not even the recipient. We never even touch on measuring the benefits for the recipient, but the giver themselves were less lonely. In the US and the UK, the giver themselves in Australia was experiencing a reduced stress, when we compare them to a waitlist control group. So this has massive implications because this is something that we can roll out much more feasibly in rural communities, in communities that have absolutely no resources at all, and to encourage pro-social action in some sort of way. So the idea of solutions is very, very difficult to answer because it is very much about what's possible.
Yeah.
And right now, as I can tell, funding is a huge problem for the sector. You know, it's often the people who want to address loneliness are often neighborhood houses that are really, they don't have those resources to do much. You know, they're already underpaid, under-resourced. This is not an issue that has received any attention or funding to do things. Yeah.
Kindness is free, right?
This is where I would say that our national hero, Dr. Hugh McKay, would say it is
Mm,
absolutely fundamental to building a healthier society and a more connected society.
yeah, that's beautiful. So, Michelle, where does your organization fit in all this? What, the role of ending loneliness together? Would you be able to share with us a little bit more about your beautiful organization?
So ending loneliness together is, I guess it's really made of a coalition of members from across the nation. And it was very much driven by the science, where we could see really a gap between what we know in science and what's being practiced in on the ground here and in policies. So what we're really trying to do is narrow that gap. But over time, it was really interesting because it's being now seen as a peak body or regarded as a peak body and regarded as, I guess, an international expert in this area. What we're really doing is we're trying to not just influence government to make systemic change, like advocating for a strong foundation like a national strategy, but also improve community awareness by changing the way we talk about loneliness, because we do know that's a highly stigmatized concept at the moment. And if we don't change the lingo of the Australian public, it'll be very hard for people who do feel lonely to seek the help they need, because they're only going to seek the help if the response is healthy,
Yeah.
right? So we do need to change the ecosystem. We're talking about loneliness like the way we did depression 20 years ago, where depression was seen as some sort of made up issue. You know, I had to convince people depression was not made up. Why, what have you got to be depressed about? You've got this, and this. You shouldn't be depressed. I hear that about loneliness now.
Mhm.
And a really interesting loneliness research has been STEM in social neuroscience at the beginning, where we looked at how lonely people process information and can see overactivation of amygdala. We can see all these brain processes that underlie loneliness, but yet we're talking about it in a way that is so trivializing, and that it's not something that does have an unconscious processes that underpin it. We need to really change the language so that people know how to talk about it, are willing to talk about it, who are able to also help others. Because at any given point, one of us here could experience loneliness tomorrow. We don't know. We're talking about high levels of loneliness or persistent loneliness. I will feel lonely at some point in my life. I will. I can guarantee you that, because that's the way life works. They will pose social challenges to you, you
Yes.
know, maybe not right now, but at some point. So how do I equip myself with the language, with the skills to manage my own loneliness? And when I don't feel in that distress, how can I help someone? So it's
Mm,
really trying to shift community attitudes, empowering action and activation on the ground. That's a huge part of our organization. Of course, other things like, because it's a kind of science-led organization, increasing the Australian evidence base, making recommendations of how we can be doing good practice on the ground. Not all social connections healthy. So, how do we really target loneliness if we want to, it's not just increasing the number of people we know.
yeah.
You know, can we be a little bit more nuanced in the approach? And of course, what are we teaching our practitioners on the ground, our GPs, our community workers? How are they talking about it? Are they talking about it? Are they holding the same biases as we do in the community? Are they being unintentionally unhelpful?
Mm,
Right? So we really got to change their practices as well.
yeah, that's fantastic. You raised a couple of things that I was just thinking about. You can be so lonely with so many people around you. And that, I suppose, is an old way of looking at things, is like getting
Yes.
out and connecting to people. But really, if it's not cutting it, yeah.
That's right. That's right. And to be able to recognize it's almost I call it social nutrition 101.
Hmm.
Like we can have access to food, but we don't know which ones are healthy for us,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
it's beautiful.
And I know you earlier you touched on obviously kindness as a way of supporting people through or addressing, getting out there. And we know in COVID there was lots of movement that was around the kindness movement and it shifts in
Mhm.
and around that. And so for me, it's, the opportunities are there to allow community groups. And I think there's the other factor is many years ago there was a stronger sense of community. People were more connected to their neighbours, to people around them, that supported components of that. And I think as society has shifted, the impacts of that have increased as well. And I can see that that probably plays out. And that's where the layers of all the things that you're talking about really needs to come in play. There's, the individual, there's the community layer, there's the service layer, there's the government layers, and how they all interrelate in supporting that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think yes, we all can play our bit. Like some people naturally will be working in the community sector on an organizational level, but we need to create a culture of connection across those levels. And as much as many people say, well, we don't need government to help and to do anything. We can do things in the grassroots. I mean, they also dictate other things that does affect the way we live, the way we work, the way we play. Workplace policies of curbing overworking so that we can actually invest in our relationships, accessibility to things. And we know loneliness disproportionately affects people who are living in more deprived neighborhoods, who have lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who are more financially strained. All those things are macro factors that affect how we feel about other people and how we relate to other people. So they do have a part to play, and it's about bringing them on a journey to help coordinate action across sectors. This is not just an educational issue or work or business issue or health issue. It is everyone's issue. How do we coordinate in such a way that makes sense to modify what they're already doing in those great portfolios? What are they already doing that they can modify to ensure that loneliness is also addressed. So it's not just one little solution. Everyone, of course, has a part to play, including you and me, within our home lives, within the relationships and people we know. But it's more than that. It's about that mobilization in across sectors that we really require.
As we've been encouraged to look at the lens of, say, inclusion, we should also be looking at the lens of loneliness and the impact of that and in across the work. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And going beyond inclusion and the idea of social cohesion, which is an absolute priority for the government right now. Social cohesion to curb political violence, for example, to ensure that people live with each other uh, in a way that doesn't, cause conflict. But it's also not just living next to each other, but it's thriving with each other that we really need to focus on.
As you're speaking, Michelle, I'm just thinking about the blue zones, and
Mhm.
different cultures, and coming back, reflecting on Australian culture. Really, we're decentralized the way that we live, I think, and maybe it is because of geographic sometimes. There's so many factors that are at
Yes.
play here.
Yes, and the idea of blue zones is really interesting because when we look at the blue zones around the world, almost all of them have some sort of culture of connection that has really integrated into the way of living.
Mm,
And of course, you have the additive effects of different kinds of food and everything else, which we almost cannot replicate exactly, but that community and that focus on high quality support is
yes.
something that we can do within our neighborhoods, within our families, with our community. And it's not impossible to do that, without all the other bits. We can do it. And I've seen other countries do it, including things like the way they build their communities, with
Yes.
urban design. They will always make sure that each neighborhood has places to eat, places to exercise, places where children can play. You can design connection into our society and then let the human factors and encourage the human factors to take place. And it's got to start from somewhere.
Yeah, beautiful. So, how do you keep yourself well? How do you
You
please
know,
share?
that's a great idea. It's very timely because while I'm busy and I also have a toddler that I have to that takes up a lot of my energy. Friendship, since I've become a parent, friendship is something that I have to be very mindful of nurturing all the time. And I'm having a friend over tonight. I mean, they might have to put up with my very, very opinionated toddler, but you know, I'm having them over, for dinner. It's being able to be nimble, flexible, where those opportunities come up to take them, and to connect. And sometimes those sorts of connections don't have to be long. And often, a 7-10 minute phone call to a girlfriend and both of us just venting to each other, is you feel good after that,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know? Yeah. And we have to be flexible, right? If you're time poor, it's done in so many different kinds of ways. And sometimes it's a simple, I'm thinking of you that really makes a difference. So I think it's about making effort, and even if there's small actions, I think they all build up to something better.
I
so
think the idea of sometimes just reaching out and just saying, "Oh, yep, you're in my thoughts," or "Hope you're well," is really powerful. And that ability to really be honest as well. I think society generally doesn't allow that level of honesty, but saying, "Actually, I'm having a rotten day,"
Yeah.
and being able to express that is so important.
Yeah, and it gives the person an opportunity to say something and to help. And often people think, oh, I don't want to be a burden to someone else. But actually, friendships and relationships are about the highs and the lows. And that sometimes people are cross at you if you don't give them the opportunity to help.
mm,
Yeah.
mm, it's very true. Yeah, I just walked out before we jumped on as well. Just walked out onto my nature strip and saw one of my neighbours that I often see, passing, and we had a 5 minute, even longer chat, and I was like, came in feeling that was so good, just learned a little bit more about her and vice versa, and
Well,
it
it
just,
doesn't have to be long. This is
yes,
this is why people often think, oh, for me to address my loneliness, I really need to make a new best friend. It's nothing about that.
mm,
This is why we're talking about this very small organic steps, capitalizing on your routine, small interactions. They don't have to be big actions. Even if you think about your relationships that you've nurtured over the years, they're often really a series of very small actions over time that happen naturally. They happen within your routines.
mm,
And that's how we build relationships. It's just got to start somewhere. And the idea of, some people really also saying, oh, I don't like small talk. But small talk's got to function. It just gives you a bit of a opener as how to the other person's feeling. Are they open to connection? And if it's not good, then go to someone else. It's just about finding those people to connect that are happy to connect right now.
yeah, beautiful. So you've probably touched on a few things for our listeners just
Mm.
now about, if there was someone at home experiencing loneliness, or their partner or someone within their space, what other words of wisdom would you offer them?
I think that many people who feel this way often feel a bit rotten about themselves. And I really need them to know that this is not because of their personality. Actually, it's just them feeling similar to feeling hungry and thirsty, and that's okay. And it's really important, especially whether you're a recipient or someone who's actually, or the person helping, or the person that's like, needing the assistance at the moment, it's actually okay to highlight that not all your social needs has to be met by one person, because often someone says, oh, what's wrong with me? Are you feeling lonely? What's wrong? What am I not doing for you? And you think about COVID. I often met lots of people who says, look, I'm here in lockdown with my family and my husband and my kids. I love them, but I really need something else. Because just because you have family and you're meeting some of those needs doesn't mean you have other kinds of social needs. And no matter what your husband does, your family or your children does, they cannot meet those needs because by pure nature, they're meeting other kinds of needs. We're not meant to meet everybody's needs. And it's actually okay to say, I'm feeling lonely at work. I don't feel lonely at home, but I feel lonely at work. I really need a friend at work to back me up. And I can tell my partner all about work politics, but he may not understand, or, something like that. And that's okay. Like being able to, when you do ask for help, you can couch it in those terms. I feel lonely. I'm not sure why,
Mm.
or I feel lonely. And there are people who have such unique situations when you do feel lonely because they feel absolutely by themselves because they have such unique situations of experience, whether it's something very specific, like chronic disease and cancer. Those sorts of things are so specific, and no matter what you say to the person who might be assisting you, who doesn't have the disease, one might feel like they don't really understand. So,
Yes.
and that's where loneliness can arise, and that's okay. It's being able to find the right people so that you feel like those social needs are being met. And so small trial and error. Don't be stuck in feeling really rotten about yourself and disempowered. This is more of a signal to think and reflect, to consider what you might need, and even congratulate yourself for recognizing that you feel lonely. Because as I say, one in two people always feel shame and they try to actively conceal it. Pat yourself on the back for recognizing that that happens, and that's okay. And think about what is it that you can or cannot do, what is it that you like or don't like, what's within the context of what's feasible for you, because everybody's different. Um, and I often say to people, learn more about it, learn how to talk about it. We have Loneliness Awareness Week now that's run every year, and this is the third year that's running. We often teach people, how do you spot loneliness? How do you help? What do we say? What do we not say? How do you ask for help without, you know, that negative response? Um, it's about starting somewhere. And right now, of course, as I say, the lingo and the understanding in the Australian community is still a bit poor, but we can make a difference. We can change things, and we can, even use me and say, "Oh, I heard this woman talking about this.
Yeah.
I don't care. Use me." This is a common issue. She said this is quite a common thing. Use the science to your advantage. Use the fact that people now understand post-COVID why someone can become lonely. Use those facts. We use the fact that we all know that, being financially strained is very tied to loneliness. All of us are financially strained in this climate. Use those common things to kind of raise those issues and to have a conversation about it.
Beautiful. Michelle, do you have, just leaving us, are there any other pearls of wisdom that you would like to share with us?
Hmm. I think that to leave with a couple of points, I think what's really important is, I hope hearing this today also inspires action. In whatever capacity you have, everybody can do something. And don't even bother making it big. It's that small little things that do make a difference. And most of us who experience loneliness will have social skills. This is not about learning social skills. I think this is around confidence and being able to gain that confidence to interact and being able to take rejections, because loneliness, putting yourself out there is risky. It is. And all of this stuff that we're asking people to do, kindness is risky, because there's a fear of rejection. There's also a cost to you in terms of your time. Those sorts of things, everything that we want people to do to really connect, meaningfully connect. If it involves change and if it involves reluctance, it's probably because there's some sort of cost to you. But think about this more generally. There's a broader cost that we're paying. We really need to think about what kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of world do we want to function in? Now, one person can't change the world, but we can add to it. And so this is about us making the commitment to create a culture of connection, to do what we can to either learn about it, advocate for it, to affect the relationships that we have. We do not have to make a new friend. It's about even perhaps improving the quality of the ones you already have. So making that commitment to yourself to improve the quality of a relationship, use as an experiment, see what happens, and really understand and learn about social nutrition. Again, what are the relationships that give to you? What are the ones that don't give to you, and how do we manage those? All those things are possible. Yes, they might take time, but it's worthwhile for us to start reflecting on some of these things.
I love that. Thank you. That's such a beautiful way to end our chat together today. And I just want you to please remind everybody, how can they get in touch with you or specifically your organization? Fantastic website, by the way.
Thank you so much for having me, Vicky and Robin. Like, it's been lovely to have a nice chat, and to a nice way to tie off a Friday as well of connection. So I'm really pleased to be able to hopefully inspire action and hope, and for people to work with us to address loneliness together.
Definitely. Thank you.
And thank you for championing it. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to say, I really do encourage everybody to go to your website, endingloneliness.com.au. Some fantastic resources on there, Michelle. They're wonderful. And the videos as well. I've watched a couple of the videos. Really, really, yeah, just so heartfelt. Love them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for supporting us.
So, as we wrap up today's conversation, I'd like to send a heartfelt thank you to Michelle, the CEO of Ending Loneliness Together, for her incredible insights, the powerful research she shared, and for shining a light on loneliness as a growing public health issue. Michelle reminded us that loneliness isn't an individual issue, but rather a societal challenge. We learned that it impacts young people, older adults, and communities alike, and that creating a sense of belonging is one of the simplest ways to help combat this growing concern. The clear takeaway for me, though, is those small, intentional acts of connection with each other really makes the difference. Whether that's a conversation, an invitation, or just a check-in. So today, I encourage you, pick up the phone and call someone who you think might need a chat. If you want more information on loneliness or the research referenced in the podcast, it's all available in the show notes. And if this episode sparks something in you, follow us, subscribe, and look out for our next episode of Let's Get Curious on Matters That Matter. Bye for now.